We are all curious about the final moments of serial criminals like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. Bigger the trail of crimes, the more terrifying the perpetrator's last words become, and their final meal, sometimes even more puzzling. Let's find out if these monsters expressed any regrets in their final moments or something much more sinister happened in their final hours. 1. Ted Bundy. Active years 1974 to 1978. Confirmed victims 30. Alleged victims 30 to 50 plus. In the 1970s, American serial criminal Theodore Robert Bundy abducted, harassed, and killed hundreds of young women and girls. He eventually confessed killing 30 lives after more than 10 years of denials and not guilty pleas. Investigators, however, think he may have had more victims overall. In order to deceive his victim, Bundy frequently pretended to be disabled or to have some other physical condition. After that, he would lure his victim to a car parked in a more secluded area, beat her senselessly, tie her up, and transport her to a far-off location where she would be harassed for hours, if not days, before viciously eliminating her. He frequently went back to the bodies of the people he had silenced, grooming and necrophilizing them until they were decomposed and destroyed by wild animals, preventing further interaction. At least a dozen of his victims had their heads hacked off, which he stored in his flat as mementos. Bundy occasionally broke into people's houses at night, tormented them while they slept, repeatedly beat them with a sledgehammer or other heavy weapon, incapacitated them, and strangled them, among other things. The last hours of Ted Bundy's life were spent at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. He eventually admitted to more than 30 killings after years of denial. However, the exact number is still unclear. There were hundreds outside the prison yelling, "Burn, Bundy, burn," in anticipation of the execution. Bundy turned down a specific request, in contrast to the lavish last meals that many death row convicts have. Rather, he was served the typical prison meal, which included steak, eggs, toast, hash browns, milk, coffee, juice, butter, and jelly. He hardly touched it. He perfected the skill of emotionally disarming people, and as the end neared, he proclaimed, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." One may think of it as an emotional farewell bid for the people he cared for, but there might be a sinister underpinning, perhaps a secret message of torment in these seemingly simple words. 2. Eileen Wuornos. Active years 1989 to 1990. Confirmed victims 7. Alleged victims 7 plus. Eileen Carol Wuornos, one of America's most notorious female serial murderers, targeted middle-aged males on Florida roadways. Unlike many serial killers who kill for pleasure, Wuornos claimed self-defense, claiming that her victims tried to harass or hurt her. However, her unpredictable conduct and fluctuating statements made the facts ambiguous. She was born into a family of neglect and abuse and had a difficult upbringing before being involved in the sex trade as a teenager. In 1989, she began targeting male clients, robbing and killing them before leaving their automobiles. She used a .22 caliber handgun to shoot her victims several times before abandoning their corpses in distant locales. Despite her claims of self-defense, the patterns of her acts indicated otherwise. She pawned her victims' possessions, used their credit cards, and resumed her murder spree without hesitation. Her ultimate arrest occurred in 1991, when officials tracked her down using fingerprints discovered in one of the stolen vehicles. She was condemned to death in 1992, following a contentious trial and many appeals. She spent 10 years on death row when her mental condition worsened dramatically. She became increasingly paranoid, feeling the government was trying to suppress her. By 2001, she had fired her attorneys and volunteered for execution, claiming she wanted to leave this earth. Unlike other vicious criminals seeking fame, Wuornos appeared to want to disappear, claiming that society had wrecked her life. In her dying days, she complained about the authorities employing sonic pressure against her and expressed hatred and disgust towards humanity. She was one of history's most problematic serial killers. Many asked if she was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of a harsh life driven to the brink. Her narrative inspired films, books, and documentaries, including Monster, 2003, starring Charlize Theron in an Oscar-winning performance. On the evening of October 8, 2002, she was brought to Florida State Prison's execution chamber. Surprisingly, she remained cool and controlled, with no dread of what was going to occur. Unlike Bundy, who had swarms of people celebrating his death, Wuornos had a more muted farewell. Wuornos denied the traditional final dinner. Instead, she picked a simple cup of coffee, in sharp contrast to the sumptuous meals that many death row convicts prefer. She was executed by lethal injection at 9:47 a.m. on October 9, 2002. Witnesses described her as unnaturally calm, without regret or feeling. She lay motionless as the medications were delivered. She murmured, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." She was pronounced dead minutes later. The mysterious remark had many wondering if she had completely lost touch with reality or if she was making one last gesture of defiance. Regardless of how history remembers her, Aileen Wuornos' dying moments were as disturbing as the atrocity she committed, leaving behind a dark mystery that continues to this day. 3. John Wayne Gacy. Active years, 1972 to 1978. Confirmed victims, 33. Alleged victims, 33 to 35. Between 1972 and 1978, American criminal John Wayne Gacy preyed on young men and boys, enticing them into his house and subjecting them to brutal abuse, torture, and death. Gacy appeared to be a successful businessman, a Democratic precinct commander, and even performed as Pogo the Clown at local charity events. Behind this facade, he committed some of the most heinous acts across modern history. Gacy's usual strategy was to deceive his victims into going to his residence on the guise of a job offer or simply for drinks. When they got inside, he would handcuff them, claiming it was part of a magic trick. With his victims confined, he subjected them to hours of severe torture that included intimate harassment, beatings, and pretend executions. Many others were strangled to death using a homemade tourniquet known as the rope trick, in which he tightened a rope around their necks with a piece of wood, gradually cutting off their oxygen supply. His crimes went unnoticed for years, despite numerous reports and suspicions. When he was ultimately apprehended in December 1978, authorities discovered the corpses of 26 victims buried beneath his house, 4 more in a nearby river and 3 elsewhere on his land. Authorities had difficulty identifying several remains due to their decomposition. Gacy was convicted of 33 killings, the most by a single individual in United States history at the time. On May 9, 1994, Gacy spent his final day in Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he was slated to be executed by lethal injection. Unlike Bundy, Gacy expressed no remorse for his atrocities. During his final interviews, he dismissed his victims as just another John, demonstrating the same arrogance and lack of empathy that characterized his years of murder. Despite being sentenced to death years ago, he was able to postpone his execution for 14 years through appeals and legal tactics. On his last night, he had exhausted all possibilities. Witnesses reported that when Gacy was led to the execution room, he was calm, even smirking, a dramatic contrast to the atrocities he had done. Unlike Bundy, who declined a special last dinner, Gacy went all for it. He requested 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC's original recipe chicken, French fries, 1 pound of strawberries, a Diet Coke. The choice of KFC was particularly distressing, given Gacy had previously supervised 3 KFC stores in Iowa before his activity spree. Some believe that his final supper was an odd homage to his previous life. He ate the whole dinner without hesitation. At 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, Gacy was strapped to the execution gurney. His dying remarks were equally frightening as his crimes. With that, the deadly injection started. However, in an unusual twist, the execution procedure was bungled. The IV line became blocked, postponing his death by 18 minutes. A horrible irony given the lengthy, agonizing deaths he caused his victims. Witnesses claim he seemed anxious and uncomfortable before passing away around 1:14 a.m. 4. Jeffrey Dahmer. Active years, 1978 to 1991. Confirmed victims, 17. Alleged victims, 17 to 20. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was one of America's most frightening serial killers. Between 1978 and 1991, he savagely terminated 17 young men and boys, practicing necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. Unlike many serial murderers who worked in secret, Dahmer's crimes were revealed in one of the most horrific discoveries in American history: his flat, which was littered with severed heads, decaying bodies, and human remains preserved in acid-filled vats. A reign of terror began in 1978, just weeks after graduating from high school, when he enticed his first victim into his house under the guise of providing a ride. He then bludgeoned him with a dumbbell, strangled him, dismembered his body, and buried the parts in his backyard. His tactics changed over time. He frequently drugged and strangled his victims before performing frightening post-mortem rituals, retaining body pieces as mementos. Many questioned his ultimate goal with all the chemicals. He admitted to attempting to produce zombie-like subservient spouses by pouring acid or boiling water into his victims' brains while they were still conscious. He subsequently said that devouring his victims transformed them into a part of him forever.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
He was apprehended on July 22, 1991, after one of his planned victims, Tracy Edwards, left his apartment in handcuffs and flagged down authorities. Officers discovered images of dismembered victims, human skulls, and a 57-gallon barrel containing disintegrating remains inside his residence. Even the most seasoned detectives were taken aback by his level of wickedness. During his trial, he pleaded guilty but mentally unstable and admitted to all 17 killings. He was sentenced to 16 life sentences in jail, totaling 941 years behind bars. However, he would not survive long enough to complete his sentence. Unlike other serial killers who were executed, he was brutally slain in jail by a fellow inmate. On November 28, 1994, Christopher Scarver, another inmate at Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution, was assigned to clean the gym with Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. Scarver, who was left alone, cornered Dahmer in a lavatory and bludgeoned him to death with a metal bar from gym equipment. His cranium had been shattered beyond recognition. Scarver subsequently claimed that he heard voices ordering him to murder Dahmer, and that Dahmer had a bizarre habit of transforming his meals into body parts and using ketchup to simulate blood, which irritated his other inmates. Dahmer's final known meal before his death was a typical jail breakfast of eggs, toast, cereal, juice, and coffee. His final recorded remarks were never officially documented. However, other accounts claim he accepted his destiny, declaring that he was willing to die and did not seek any special care or protection in prison. His death drew little compassion, as the families of his victims thought justice had finally been delivered. 5. Joseph Mad Dog Taborski. Active years, 1950 to 1957. Confirmed victims, 6. Alleged victims, 6+. Joseph Mad Dog Taborski was one of Connecticut's most dreaded criminals, responsible for a savage killing spree that left a path of horror. His acts were extremely heinous, characterized by mindless brutality and cold-blooded murder. His reign of terror, subsequently known as the Mad Dog Killings, ended with his capture and death, making him the final person to die in Connecticut's electric chair. Taborski's first documented crime occurred in 1950 when he and an accomplice, Arthur Coulombe, attempted to steal from a Hartford business. During the heist, Taborski shot the store owner Louis Wolfson in the face. Fortunately, Wolfson survived and identified Taborski as the gunman. However, due to a lack of sufficient evidence, Taborski was acquitted and went free, a mistake that lost the lives of 6 innocent people. Taborski displayed no remorse upon his release. Between 1956 and 1957, he embarked on a murderous spree, robbing local businesses and petrol stations before murdering his victims in cold blood. His method was simple but terrifying, forcing victims to lie face down before shooting them in the back of the head. His attacks were so merciless that investigators discovered he murdered even when there was no apparent need, giving him the moniker Mad Dog. His binge stopped when his younger accomplice, 16-year-old Richard Dick Lohman, was apprehended and turned against him. With Lohman's testimony and fresh evidence, Taborski was convicted and condemned to death. Taborski passed away on May 17, 1960, at the Connecticut State Prison in Wethersfield. Unlike many other death row convicts who spent their final minutes pondering, he remained strangely calm, displaying neither regret or fear. Despite his heinous deeds, Taborski denied religious guidance or final consolation. Prison officials observed that he looked unconcerned, seemingly removed from the fact that he was hours away from death. He denied any particular final remarks, preferring to stay silent till the end. Unlike Ted Bundy, who denied a personal meal request but received a normal jail meal, Taborski made it obvious that he wanted nothing. He declined the usual Last Supper, opting instead to fast before being executed. It's unclear if this was an act of disobedience or an attempt to control his dying moments. Joseph Taborski was strapped into the electric chair at 12:12 a.m. His face was expressionless when the switch was flipped, blasting 2,000 volts of electricity into his body. Witnesses said that his body convulsed fiercely before becoming limp. Within minutes, he was declared dead. Taborski's reign of terror was ended, but his name remained infamous in Connecticut's criminal history. His execution was the final one in Connecticut's electric chair, bringing the end of the state's use of the death penalty. Despite the ferocity of his acts, he never expressed regret, an appropriately icy finale for a guy who showed no mercy to his victims. 6. Frederick Charles Wood. Active years, 1926 to 1960. Confirmed victims, 5. Alleged victims, possibly more. Born in Elmira, New York in 1911, Frederick Charles Wood started a violent criminal career that lasted more than 30 years. Wood came from a decent law-abiding family, but his life was tainted by a string of vicious killings and recurrent jail terms. Wood's first known murder occurred when he was just 14 years old. He poisoned his 16-year-old lover, Cynthia Longo, in 1926 by putting arsenic in cream puffs because he thought she was cheating. Longo did not survive, but 2 other females who ate the tainted pastries did. She suffered from dilation of the heart caused by excessive vomiting, which was a mistaken diagnosis made by the coroner at the time. The case was left unexplained for decades. The ruthless murder of a woman on Elmira's south side in 1933 marked the height of Wood's criminal activity. He stabbed her more than 140 times and assaulted her with an iron club, breaking her skull. He was released on parole in 1940 after serving just 7 years, notwithstanding the horrible nature of the offense. Wood murdered once more in 1942. He assaulted a man, slashed his neck, stomped on his head, and struck him with a beer bottle. He said his girlfriend had been bothered by the victim. He served over 20 years in jail as a result of this conviction before being released on parole in 1960. Wood's aggressive inclinations returned within a few weeks after his parole in 1960. In New York City, he murdered 2 elderly men, Frederick Sess, 78, and John Rashino, 62. Both guys were discovered dead in their flat after suffering terrible beatings and slicing injuries. Wood was promptly captured and confessed to the crimes, stating a wish to face death immediately. Wood maintained an aggressive attitude while awaiting execution at Sing Sing prison. He refused all attempts to postpone his sentencing, saying in a letter to his counsel, "I do not welcome any intrusion into this stinking case of mine." He refused any aid from the civil society protesting against capital punishments. This refusal was a testimony to a psychopathic mindset that craved total control. This desire to control translated to his own death too, just as he once controlled others. That very psychopathic logic made him choose nothing but a cigarette as his last meal, if that can be categorized as a formal meal. Finally, on March 22, 1963, Wood was executed by electric chair. As he was being prepped for execution, he allegedly puffed his cigarette while smiling at the spectators and said, "Gentlemen, this is an educational effort. You are going to see how electricity damages wood. Enjoy yourselves." 7. William Bonin, the infamous freeway killer. Active years, 1979 to 1980. Confirmed victims, 21. Alleged victims, 36 plus. William Bonin, better known as the Freeway Killer, was one of America's most heinous murderers. Between 1979 and 1980, he prowled Southern California's roadways, targeting young boys and teens. His approach was extremely brutal. He offered rides to hitchhikers, abducted them, and subjected them to terrible torture before ending them and discarding their remains on roadways. Bonin's murdering spree came to a stop in June 1980 when he was captured. His actions were so heinous that the judge hearing his trial referred to him as the worst serial killer in the history of California. In 1982, he was convicted of 14 murders and put to death, with an extra life term for further homicides. Bonin hunted for victims in a particular way. He would entice young males, hitchhikers, and fugitives by frequently promising them a ride. Then, he would tie them up and torment them physically and sexually for hours after they were inside his van, which turned into a mobile torture dungeon. He tortured his victims with ropes, tire irons, and other implements before ending them by strangulation. The fact that Bonin had other accomplices who assisted him in his cruel actions added to the unsettling nature of his case. William Pugh, Gregory Miley, James Monroe, and Vernon Butts, his associates, occasionally participated in the abuse by being present during the killings, but without hesitation or regret, Bonin took the initiative. Bonin was very straightforward about his acts, compared to other serial murderers who either denied their murders or played mind games with authorities. He confessed to 21 killings after being arrested, describing each one with icy indifference. He went so far as to say, "I'd still be killing if I wasn't caught." On February 23, 1996, Bonin passed away at San Quentin State Prison. Bonin exhibited unsettling composure and little regret for his crimes, in contrast to Ted Bundy, who showed nervousness prior to his death. He completely accepted his fate and turned down any last-minute pleas. Bonin feasted on a massive meal for his last meal. He asked for 2 pizzas with pepperoni and sausage, 3 chocolate ice cream scoops, 3 Coca-Colas. Bonin ate everything without a flicker of fear or regret. Ironically, his last words were, "I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did that, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." Bonin became the first person executed by lethal injection in California when he was put to death at 12:01 a.m. As the narcotics entered his system, witnesses said he displayed no remorse or unease. Hundreds of people, many of whom were relatives of his victims, gathered outside the prison. As word of his passing spread, some rejoiced and held placards that said, "Justice served." 8. Douglas Franklin Wright. Active years, 1969 to 1996. Confirmed victims, 7. Alleged victims, 10+. Wright's first known offense was a violent crime for which he was found guilty in 1969 and sentenced to 35 years in prison. In spite of this, he was released on parole after only 13 years. He found it difficult to reintegrate into society after being released, and by 1991, he had started pursuing homeless people while pretending to be helping them. Before committing his atrocities, he would win their trust by promising them food, housing, or employment. His behavior quickly intensified in 1996, resulting in a series of episodes that attracted the attention of law enforcement. When an acquaintance revealed his actions and he was arrested, his arrogance proved to be his undoing. One of Wright's signatures was to sexually harass his victims before shooting them. Wright was found guilty of 5 killings but has been linked to 7. Prior to his execution, he also made references to further murders in other states, but his death toll was only ever verified at 7. After being taken into custody in February 1996, Wright confessed to his crimes while being questioned. He received a death sentence due to the overwhelming evidence. Wright declined to challenge his execution, in contrast with many death row inmates who do so. Declaring that he wanted to deal with the repercussions of his acts as quickly as possible, he rejected any appeals. His case resulted in Oregon's first execution since 1962. Wright's final supper was a big Coca-Cola, a plate of fries, and 2 premium cheeseburgers. Wright apparently ate everything without question. Wright was escorted into the Oregon State Penitentiary's execution chamber on September 6, 1996. He was ready for the process and stayed composed and emotionless. His parting remarks were straightforward. "I want to say I'm sorry to my family. That's all." The procedure started at 12:16 a.m. According to witnesses, Wright closed his eyes and let out a long breath without displaying any signs of panic. Minutes later, he was declared dead. Wright's last moments were calm, with only a few spectators and authorities present, in contrast to Ted Bundy, whose execution attracted sizable crowds. 9. Peter Manuel, the Beast of Birkinshaw. Active years, 1956 to 1958. Confirmed victims, 8. Alleged victims, 9+. In the 1950s, Scottish-American serial murderer Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel, popularly known as the Beast of Birkinshaw, tormented Scotland. Manuel was a crafty predator with a perverted feeling of superiority who made fun of the police and the relatives of his victims. He even went so far as to send anonymous messages to detectives ridiculing their failure to apprehend him. Manuel was a cold-blooded murderer who deliberately targeted and murdered entire families. He frequently lingered in his victims' houses after killings, eating their meals and even feeding their dogs before idly leaving without expressing regret. Despite his brief 2-year reign of terror, Scotland was rocked by his actions. In 1956, Manuel eliminated 17-year-old Anne Nealance by bludgeoning her to death with an iron rod, which was his first known murder. However, the 1958 Smart Family Massacre stands out as his most notorious crime. After shooting and ending Peter Smart, his wife Doris, and their 10-year-old son Michael, he spent the weekend at their home, dressing like them, eating their meals, and acting as though he lived there. After the killings, Manuel continued to play psychological tricks. He offered the distraught parents false hope after ending Isabella Cook, leading them to assume she had fled rather than being massacred. He was eventually captured as a result of his utter recklessness and arrogance. Self-assured, Manuel dismissed his attorneys and decided to represent himself in his May 1958 trial. He tried using his keen wit to influence the jury and even cross-examined witnesses. However, the evidence was overwhelming against him. The jury convicted him guilty of 7 murders after 3 hours of deliberation, and he was given the death penalty. Manuel's final supper was the night before he was to be executed. He enjoyed a plate of fish, a plate of chips, and a glass of milk. Peter Manuel was sent to the gallows at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison in the wee hours of July 11, 1958. Upon being asked whether he had any last remarks, he only grinned and replied, "Turn up the radio and I'll go quietly." Harry Allen, his executioner, quickly completed the hanging, and at 8 a.m., Manuel was declared dead. Ted Bundy or Eileen Wuornos, the fascination with serial offenders continues because they drive us to consider what lurks deep within the human soul. We want to know about their last moments in hopes of getting some closure for the victims and their families. Were their final remarks deliberate messages intended to haunt us for all time? Or were they the meanderings of troubled minds? Let us know in the comments section below. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the evil that lurks behind.